Due to the nature of these photographic educational tapes, color bars are presented as a reference for your television. Adjusting the hue on your set to match this chart will ensure the highest quality reproduction of the images on this tape.
Innovative doesn't mean to do what has always been done. It means to do something different and unique. Portrait photographers have a little bit of a difficult time being innovative because they're not taught a science or a craft in photography, they're taught a method. Photographers get together and show photographers how they're doing what they're doing, placement of lights, where everything is exactly. They don't explain why, they just do this and it'll look like this. Photographers then take that, go back, and start doing that. They start copying what somebody else has been doing. That produces what we call a traditional style. And it has to be traditional or constant because they don't really know any better. They don't know any different. They've been taught a method. So if we can stop for a moment, take this thing on as a craft, as a science, and organize to where we know it inside and out, then if we do think of something innovative, something that hasn't been done, we instantly know how to do it, and for that, we'll be thinking of much more innovative concepts than have been thought in the past.
Cascades of muslin and a warm background glow add to the personalities of a young woman and her son in this series of images entitled Portraits in Pastel. The use of a large light source and soft cotton fabrics combine to create this unique yet simple portrait setting.
The idea in this particular photograph was to create a very contemporary style of photography, a little bit different than what most people have seen. The whole idea in portraiture anymore, since imagery is so prolific and every place you turn there's images to look at, it's really important that the portrait you do take of people, especially women and their children or men and their children, whatever, has to be a little bit different than what's been done in the past. I mean, we are so affected by images that to grab attention anymore, it's got to be unique, especially with the large portrait outlets, all the department stores getting into portraiture. When they come into your studio, they want to see something different, something kind of alive. And this particular setup fits certain people. I wouldn't do a lot of attorneys in three-piece suits sitting down here with their children, but I would do a portrait of Barbara Yulin, this particular woman I know, and her child, because this fits her. She's into muslin. She wears a lot of cotton. So it is to produce a style of photography which fits a lot of personalities and to produce a style of portraiture which is a little bit different than what most people have seen.
With the client en route to the studio, Collins and his assistant Kevin have no time to waste in setting up for the day's shoot. Taking a little closer look at the setup, we can see that a Lightform P42 panel with 2 layers of translucent fabric and a Broncolor Pulso 4 strobe system were used as a main light. A P22 frame with black fabric is connected to the front side of the main panel with double clips to contain any spill light and act as a gobo for the lens. A second Broncolor strobe head with a sheet of Rosco Lux amber gel and a 2-stop ND gel was aimed at the white seamless background paper. 2 more P22 frames, this time with white reflective fabric, were set opposite the main panel to act as a non-directional reflector fill. Finally, a Hasselblad 500 ELX with a 250mm Zeiss lens was assembled on the Phobos stand to complete the setup. Dean Collins talks about the use of muslin in portraiture.
The first time I ever saw muslin just the way it is, used natural in a portrait, is we were in a studio, we were painting backgrounds, and we didn't finish the background in time. The client showed up, we had a piece that was not touched at all with paint, so we threw that in there, and we found that we could change the background colors and tones on it by working with color gels on it. It was neutral, so it could be affected by any color gel. You pick up this material just by going to any large fabric outlet, and they sell it for, they call it pattern fabric or pattern muslin, which they make their patterns for a real high quality dress out of this material. After the patterns are done, it looks like it's going to fit, they take the pattern apart and then use the good material with this, so it's kind of like throwaway material. It's real cheap. And it can be tied and tie-dyed, it can be painted, it can carry lots of different water-based paints into it. It's a real unique material.
Model Barb Yulin is brought onto set, and Dean begins by working a pose to match the comfortable feel of the soft cotton surroundings. Collins directs assistant Dave Lovell in positioning the background strobe close to the paper to create a rapid fall-off with the warm burst of light.
Okay, it's 4-6.
Reflective readings are then taken off the background with a 5-degree spot attachment on a Minolta 4-meter. The readings enable Collins to set the desired gradation of light from the background strobe and to check the relative brightness of the background burst compared to the initial incident reading of the subject area.
One more time, hold on, go. 11-4, say 11-4, so I got an 8-1. 8-1 up in the corner should go pure white and then grade 8 off. So let's try it. Okay.
Prepared for his first Polaroid check print, Collins sets his camera at f5.6 and makes the exposure. The first check print is successful, with the proper exposure values in the diffused highlights and a soft edge transfer to the shadow area. Collins is pleased with the results of his test shot and decides to put the image on film. Using Kodak Ektachrome EPN 120, he captures the different moods of Barb in her pastel setting.
Very slowly bringing the nose back into me. Keep the hand up there, but keep it just a little bit below the chin. Right there. That's good. Drop the head a little bit down. Okay, right there. Good. Right there. Okay, touch of a smile. Whoa. Lower the head just a little bit down. No. Okay, a little taller in the back. Okay, right there. Good. Okay, yeah, draw it. Now,
Collins explains how to create the soft pastels.
Working with color gels off of backgrounds, there's two ways you can really do it. You can either have a pure saturated color, which is important to either work with a black background or at least have the background a pure black when only the main light goes off. Even a white piece of paper can appear black if no light gets to it from the main light. But if you want a pastelish feeling, kind of a very light pastel feeling, you first of all let some of the main light strike the background or bring the background in very close behind the subject to where some of the main light contaminates the background. With just the main light firing off and reflector fill reflecting into the subject, you'd have kind of a dark gray or a grayish background. Then when you add your color to it, you have a mixture of that gray with the color, which gives you more of a pastel feeling. This can all be done and figured out working with reflective meter readings relative to incident readings in front of your subject to tell you what the actual background brightness is going to be. With that light bouncing off and the amber coming off, it creates a little bit of a separation on the subject, a little bit of warmness, and then as it strikes these folds, especially the dark side of the folds on the back side, it creates these warm amber separation and gives a lot of texture and warmth to this feeling, especially with this warm contact between a mother and a son as we were going for in this portrait.
Collins switches from the 250mm to a 150mm lens to create a full-figure portrait of his subject, while also preparing for the addition of her child to the photograph. By choosing to go with a shorter focal length lens, Collins retains the close personal contact that is vital to portraiture. A second incident reading is taken after the subject is slightly reset for the full-frame composition.
Turn your face into me. Drop the head down right there. Okay, touch of a smile, kind of a...
As Collins continues shooting a series of portraits for Barb, note that the background strobe has also been moved outside the new viewing area and has a slower gradation to cover a larger background area.
Yeah, great. Then with the hand like right in here, just kind of like exactly. Great. Drop the head just a little bit down. That's it. Turn the face into me. Soften.
A close look at the components that make up our portrait in pastel reveals the evolution of the photograph. Using only the main strobe as a source of illumination, extreme contrast is produced between the specular highlight and the diffused highlight. The small source of light also produces a hard edge transfer between the diffused highlight and shadow. Our second image shows us the reduction in contrast between the specular highlight and the diffused highlight when the large P42 diffusion panel is placed between the light source and the subject. By diffusing the main light, we have also produced a much softer transfer edge between the diffused highlight and shadow. With the addition of the reflector fill, the contrast ratio between the diffused highlight and the shadow is lowered, producing a soft, even illumination. Finally, the background strobe is placed close to the seamless paper to create a gradation of light from corner to corner. The addition of an amber gel adds warmth to the portrait and completes the evolution of this portrait in pastel. To understand the metering process that Collins used to set the values across the background, we must first take an incident meter reading in the subject area. With the dome of the meter facing the light source, the reading establishes a hypothetical 18% value in the subject area. The camera is set at f5.6, a setting that we will refer to as the value of 1. A reflective reading will tell you what to set your camera at in order to make that surface you're reading an 18% value. Whether it is black, white, or any other color, it will appear as an 18% value if the camera is set at the suggested reading. Collins' reflective readings from the upper corner of his image down toward his subject are f16, f11, and f8, respectively. By opening or closing the f-stop on the camera, one can now effectively control the brightness of those background areas. Collins has set the camera at f5.6, or the value of 1. Since f16 is 8 times brighter than f5.6, just as f5.6 is 8 times a larger lens opening than f16, we can then consider the respective lighting ratios 8:1 or 3 stops brighter than 1, 4:1 or 2 stops brighter than 1, and 2:1, which is only 1 stop brighter than the value of 1. With the understanding of this metering process, you can accurately predict the brightness of your backgrounds before the camera is even loaded with film.
There's lots of strobes that are on the market. They range in multiple powers and multiple sizes. And another thing they range in is what's called symmetrical or asymmetrical. Asymmetrical is the ability to have X amount of power in this strobe head and have another amount of power in this, 200 watt seconds in this strobe head, 100 watt seconds in this strobe head, how you throw the switches. This particular strobe we're working with right now is extremely versatile, controllable within 1/10 of a stop, but it's a symmetrical strobe, meaning that the power is even throughout the strobe heads. If you have 200 watt seconds in one strobe head and you throw another strobe head on that power packet, both of them go to 100 watt seconds apiece. So it divides it up evenly. 4 strobe heads would all get 50 watt seconds apiece then. So that is a system which is very good and very controllable, but yet it can, in this case, we needed less power on the background relative to the subject. I took an incident reading of the subject. It told me what to set my camera at. In this case, it was 5, 6.5. But the background read f45, reflective. Well, it told me that if I set my camera at f5, 6.5, that the background would be extremely overexposed, very washed out, no color at all, and I wanted to have that amber effect. I wanted to have what's called an 8:1 ratio, meaning that it would be white in the corner and then it would be a 2:1 directly behind the subject, the fall off across the background. So we knew the only way we could do it is cut the background by 3 stops. Well, you can't cut the power on one strobe head, so instead of cutting the power, we took what's called Roscoe ND, or neutral density material. They call it mid-gray in their book, and it has 3 stops of density in it. It doesn't change the color, it just stops the amount of light coming through it. And by putting that over the strobe head, it cut 3 stops of power off the background, but kept the main light the same because we didn't affect the main light. So now the background is reading reflective f16. I was shooting at f5.6, f5, 6.5. So now the background was 8:1 or a 6:1 in brightness. And that's one way you can control your background brightnesses is with ND materials, or even any brightnesses. You can put ND materials on any of the strobe heads and control their powers if you're working with a symmetrical strobe. The shot that we wanted is this contact between the mother and a son in the situation, or at least the mother by herself. We wanted a window light effect, a very soft wraparound, comfortable light, especially with this material, creating that whole illusion of soft light. People say, oh, it looks like a window light. Window light is soft. Window light is soft only because it's big. Window light is big, like a big bay window. If you have a small porthole, which is a window, isn't soft because it's a small source. So you can take a strobe and identify that window light is really caused, the softness of a window light is caused by the size of the window and not that it's a window. You can take diffusion materials, fire a strobe through it, and because of that size, create an illusion when you look at it to say, God, it looks like it was taken by a window. Okay. Oh my God.
After completing the series of portraits with Barb, her son Taylor is brought in for the final series. But as all photographers know, a young child may sometimes have a different idea of just how to go about getting his portrait done.
Okay, there we go. Taylor, Taylor. Oh, I like the hand right there. That's fun. That's right. Good. Oh, boy, it's
Collins shoots the final series with the 150mm lens, setting his actual f-stop at f5.6½. By underexposing the film by 1/2 stop and overdeveloping or pushing by 1/2 stop, Collins retains the ability to push or pull his film in final development without affecting the color balance of the film.
Okay, get him right over here. Get him right over here. So, whoa, how about right there? Okay. Taylor. Okay. Whoa. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's a little crunchy. Okay, get down here low. Whoop. Okay. Yeah. Okay, right there. There are a lot of people that specialize in children. I do not specialize in children. Fortunately for me, they've invented what's called roll film, to where I have 12 shots, 12 chances on every roll that I put in that camera. And working within a motor drive camera, in this case, ELX Hasselblad, I was just going for it, just that split moment, say, bingo, we got it. So out of maybe 12 shots, we'll get 2, 3, 4 shots. Working with a 150mm lens on a Hasselblad down real low, you had the motor capability, you had a little bit of wideness where you get the mother and the child. If you do get a shot that's just great of the child, you can crop in. People say, well, it's going to be a little grainy. In this particular effect, with this type of muslin feeling, people accept grain. Look at David Hamilton's work, which had the heavy diffusion and heavy grain. So people are used to that kind of an art feeling. But to stay low and with the camera, fire in, have a lot of communication with the child. When he finally does give you that expression, it's a friendly thing. It's not you're shooting down on him. You're actually right into him. So that's why I work with a low camera angle. Plus, you're on their level. They're a little bit more, they don't like people looking down at them. Nobody does. The whole aspect of this kid, though, is he was a friendly kid. He wasn't a screamer or a crier. He was just squirrely. He was squirreling around. And we had one thing going for us, though, is that the kid loved food. So we could coax him into it. And after 2 or 3 rolls, we finally got probably the expression that we wanted, just the shot we wanted, and we ended up with a kind of a fat kid. But that's the mother's problem. Huh? Okay. Tell you what. It's your turn. It's your turn. That's better. Oh, I'll get in there. No problem. Don't get pissed. Okay, here we go. Open it. Up, right there. Good. Hey, good job. Get him back over there, you know? Okay, grab that kid. Oh, kid, pull set down.
In this classic high-key portrait, entitled Claire, Collins controlled each element of the photograph to create the illusion of day for night. A thorough understanding of natural daylight qualities and the busy schedule of a young businesswoman permitted this portrait to be taken just prior to 10 p.m.
In photographing this young lady in her home, if you notice, the home is very light pastel area, a lot of windows. Obviously, they like that house full of lights. A lot of light during the daytime. So with the blonde, light furniture, light clothes, to have windows being very dark back there it just wouldn't fit the personality or even the home. So by manipulating with a strobe outside to create a natural look in this case, realizing that when you're inside of a home, your eye exposes for the tonalities and the brightness within that home, and the outside is much brighter, so that's why it normally washes out. If you ever look at anybody in a home, usually the outside is much brighter than and naturally is when you're outside there and your eyes exposing for that. So it create a natural feeling of that girl's skin tone, hair, clothes, within her home, her key, and that was the whole plan here, is to create a very natural situation for her. This angle right here is about where the camera is going to be. You're going to run.
After arriving at the client's home, Collins and his assistant, Mark Shapiro, planned the lighting setup with the help of Tony Corbell, acting as stand-in.
Outside to give him just silhouettes, so to give the texture of the daytime, so it doesn't look like so dark back there with all those whites and high key. Plus, she's got blonde hair, so.
The outdoor setup begins with a series of Lightform P22 panels with white reflective fabrics. The panels are connected to each other with double clips, eventually creating a solid white cyclorama for the background of the photograph. Mark sets a bare bulb bronze-color strobe head on a mini stand and aims the light source directly at the reflective panels. Power is drawn from a Pulso 4 power pack. Inside the home, Dean Collins sets up the Scene RP2 4x5 camera. A 210mm f5.6 Schneider DB lens is Collins' choice for the portrait. Assistant Kevin Scott Schumacher begins the indoor lighting setup with a Lightform P42 panel. 2 layers of ripstop nylon diffusion fabric are added to create the main light source. A P15 with opaque fabric is added to the front of the main panel to act as a gobo for the lens. Set behind the P42 panel, a bronze-color strobe with reflector will create the main light. The strobe is hooked up to a Pulso 4 power pack. To complete the setup, a bare bulb strobe is aimed at the ceiling in the corner to create soft, even illumination for the background, while also providing separation for the subject.
When you walk into somebody's home, you don't really want to tear it apart. You have to move a few things, maybe a coffee table, things that are easily put in. Sofas, things like that are kind of off limits because you don't know what's under the sofa. And they usually don't want you to find out. So you try to keep it intact as well as you can. That's why the lighting system has to be as simple as possible. This particular shot in high key, if you ever note, subtle shadow forms are what's going to create primarily the structure. So if your shadows are too dark, too hard cutting, you're going to notice them too much. Imperfections on a white face are identified by shadows. A wrinkle is a shadow, a bump is a shadow. So the light quality we wanted here, we wanted to have a very soft edge transfer and a fairly light shadow relative to the diffuse, meaning the contrast shouldn't be too strong. A large source, in this case a P42 with a strobe firing through it, created that large bank, very soft illumination quality. And the actual room created its own reflector fill. The whole room bounced the light around. Separation light in the back with an amber gel bouncing off, illuminating the room with a warmer feeling, again, kind of a tonality of that day, like a late afternoon look, giving a little bit of color tones within her hair, not too much, just a nice kind of a warming separation. And then following the strobe on the outside, firing off plants inside this large cyclorama of panels we put together to create that high-key look, and then the plants were inside that, creating there more of the pastel feeling of that sun coming through. It's a very simple setup and very lightweight material, meaning that those panels did fall over, they're not going to break a lamp or break a table like a lot of the old equipment made out of steel that we used to use so much.
Before taking exposure readings, Collins uses a Calumet exposure calculator to determine the bellows extension factor. A loss of 1/3 of a stop is determined. Incident meter readings are then taken to determine the relative exposure values of the main light and separation light. Collins finds equal exposure values, or a ratio of 1:1. To ensure a pure white background, a 5-degree spot attachment on the Minolta 4 meter is used for a reflective reading off of the outdoor cyclorama. Dean Collins explains.
The trees, small plants, as I created the texture of the outdoors, you couldn't really make them out. They're slightly out of focus, and they just had a very light, well, pastel. They're darker than the background. But to guarantee that the actual background went white, putting the panels out there and striking it with light was brought it up to guarantee, though, a perfect white was nothing more than realizing that when the incident meter reading was taken in front of the subject, that gave us a reading of f16, which is the same as a reflective reading off of a gray card. So it tells us that gray will be gray at f16 within the subject's area. Taking a reflective reading off those panels outside, as reviewing them, the reflective reading said f64 the first time out. Well, f64, if you set your camera to f64, that means that background will be 18% gray. But if you set your camera for f16 for the subject's area to properly expose the subject, that background will be 16 times brighter because your aperture is 16 times wider at f16 than it is at f64. Well, who needs something 16 times brighter than 18% gray? That's much, much more bright than we need. 8 times brighter than 18% is white without detail. So by cutting the power on the strobes down there to where it read f45, I guaranteed that the background was going to be pure white with a little bit of detail. She was going to lose the fine detail of the hair strands hanging down. They weren't going to be eaten up because of so much we'll call blow-by, all that brightness that would be coming back. That's just not necessary. 8 times brighter than 18% is white without detail.
Ready for the first Polaroid check print, Collins has Claire take her place in a comfortable pose and then makes the first exposure.
Good. Okay, I'm going to raise the camera angle just so I can shoot a little bit down and knock off the darker area. That's just the top of the panels are missing, so that'll take care of that area. So we got the high key, bringing shrubbery on both sides and the outside, just to see the way the tonality is right here. Guess what I want? Just draping in right in there, and then we'll drop an amber gel, a little bit of separation amber gel. It's going to warm with it, just to separate, just in the hair, and also warm the whole back. It's just too much monochromatic. I mean, everything is just so light. It's just a little too much for me. Back it up. Back it up. Move it in.
Directing from camera point of view, Collins has the outdoor plants pulled further into the background of the shot. And then Kevin adds a Roscoe Lux amber gel to the indoor strobe for added warmth to the separation light. Collins reloads the 4x5 and makes the second test shot. To fully understand the effects of each element in Collins' lighting setup, we must see the evolution of the photograph. Our first image reveals the effect of a direct strobe used as the only source of illumination. Note the high specularity caused by the small source of light and the hard edge transfer between the diffused highlight and shadow. The addition of the P42 diffusion panel reduces the contrast between the specular highlight and the diffused highlight on the subject, while also producing a gradated transfer edge between the diffused highlight and shadow. With the separation strobe in place, the key of the interior background is brought up, and the separation is provided for the subject. Also note, the separation strobe creates some reflector fill, reducing the contrast between the diffused highlight and shadow. By adding an amber gel to the separation strobe, both the interior walls and the subject separation light take on the warm tones of a late afternoon. Finally, the outdoor background strobe, set to overexpose the white reflective tone by an 8:1 ratio, adds a convincing look of daytime to this classic home portrait. Collins talks about using 4x5 for portraiture.
Usually photographing a person, we wouldn't use a view camera. It's a little slow and cumbersome, but the Scenar offers that capability of dropping that film in there and shutting the shutter down, cocking it for you, and then as you shut your cable down to fire it off, it shuts the aperture for you. So it's a real fast type of view camera to work with people. It's one of the best. And view cameras are wonderful for people, as they always were in the past, because of the ability to retouch. I mean, the less you have to amplify your piece of film to make the print, 30-40, 40-60 mural, which is what this shot was really designed for, is a large mural shot. The less you have to expand it, the less you're going to see any retouching that you may have to do to pick up any minor details, any minor crow's feet. Retouching right now in America is a big saleable item. Photographers are charging a lot of money for retouching because it's, look at what they're charging for cosmetic surgery, to remove wrinkles from eyes and tummy tucks and rebuilding the body. So photographers are starting to realize, well, if they charge so much for surgery, well, then why don't we charge for it in photography?
Using Kodak 6122 and VPS-3 4x5 sheet film, Dean Collins begins working with Claire to put a series of final images on film.
Okay, a little bit of a smile up top.
smile. Yeah, soft smile, okay. Bring your face just a little bit more that way. Eyes back in the camera. Drop the head a little bit down. Yeah, soft. Eyes a little bit wider. There you go. Excellent, 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 excellent. All right. Bounce some photons. Bounce some photons. Very good. Okay, right there. Super, super. Okay, isn't that cute? Okay. Okay, great. Touch. Good, good. Touch of a smile. Come on, come on. Come big smile. Bring the face just a little bit off right there, okay? Great. Okay, watch this, watch this, watch this. Just, there you go. Okay, now bring it slowly this way. Now watch just a little bit back, and turn a little bit more that way, a little bit more.
Collins explains his lens selection for the portrait.
Good, good, good. The lens we used in this situation was a 210, slightly telephoto. Often people, when they go into home and environments, they'll use wide angle lens to pick up the entire environment of that tone. I didn't really want that in this situation. This was more of a classical head and shoulder, 3/4 length photograph of a single person, so we used a slightly telephoto lens. If I was going to do the entire family on the sofa, whatever, we'd have used a wide angle lens, picked up the entire environment of the home and the keys. Lit it probably the same, but choice of optic often will come down to how big of an area you have to photograph and how many people are going to be in the photograph. That's good right there. Okay, excellent, very good.
As Collins continues shooting, he checks his focus with a loop on the 4x5 ground glass to ensure no movement has occurred while changing film holders. Detailed log sheet is kept with notes on exposure and development for each transparency film holder.
Right there. There's a little, watch the head.
Note that the assistant is positioned to rapidly change film holders as Dean Collins makes the final exposures.
Face across, right there. Bring it back into me just a little bit. Excellent, right there. Okay, right there. And that camera right there, soft.
Looking at the final image, we can note the qualities that make the portrait a success. The large bank of illumination that Collins used as his main light source produced a natural-looking, soft-edge transfer that minimized any roughness in Claire's light skin, while the warm separation light in her hair, along with the textures of the background trees and the overexposed background, create a convincing outdoor effect that completes the high-key portrayal of Claire. Dean Collins adds some closing comments.
Any more women, especially in her age bracket, between the 20s and the 40s, are a working class. They're out making a living along with a husband. So to do a classical portrait, sometimes you don't have the ability to go in during the daytime. Woman's not there, she's working. So to photograph at night is often the situation. We wanted a daytime shot, though, to create that light key. Taking a strobe outside and realizing that what is daytime visually, photographically, is nothing more than the way the eye works, the way the brightness of the background will affect the eye as the eye exposes for the indoors. So it's a fairly easy situation here, and you can work around people's schedule and create any types of moods, any times of day, as if you know your lighting. The concept that exposures are very subjective. Objectively, we do. We have our meters, we have 18% concepts. All that's correct to get us within the ballpark. When I say within the ballpark, it means that an art director may have a different opinion than what I do of a good exposure. I may look at a transparency, he may look at a transparency, I may think it's right on an exposure, and he may think it's a little dark, a little over. Well, he's got the checkbook, so he's right. And I want to make sure that the art director is always pleased. So the concept of exposing film a certain way is important. The way we expose the film is realizing that you can overdevelop, you can push, we'll call it, from one full stop from normal development, but you cannot pull. If you push, you can go one full stop without any contrast change or really much color change, but if you pull at all, even pull a third, you're going to start flattening out the transparency and you're going to start shifting color heavily. So this gives us the ability to work within a development range, which means we underexpose our film from a normal exposure 1/2 stop. Whatever the Polaroid looks good at or whatever our meter says, to set an 80% value within that area on the diffused highlight of the subject, we underexpose at a 1/2 stop. Then we have the lab automatically overdevelop at a 1/2 stop. Now we're into what's called a 1/2 stop push. Next day the art director comes in and notes that, okay, that looks like a good exposure. If he feels that's good, then we'll run them all at a 1/2 stop push. If he feels it's a little bit dark or a little bit light, we have the ability to push and pull within that range without any fear of color shift. We can push it a half stop or pull it a half stop and still be within our normal range of development without any contrast or color shift. Gives a lot of flexibility, and art directors like the ability to come in the next day and take a look, say, fine, that's the range I want. The key to it, though, is that you have to expose every piece of film at that set. If you expose frame 1 at a certain rating, then the next 10 frames that you expose of the same setup must be the exact same setting. So when they do push or pull all of them the same, that the exposures stay consistent all the way through. It's a lot better doing that than underexposing 1 1/3, overexposing 1 1/3, and exposing one right on. Because if you want 4 transparencies, that means you got to do 12 shots to get the 4 shots. There's several ways of doing this development control, depending on if you're dealing with roll film or you're dealing with sheet film. If you're dealing with roll film, you should always keep 1 magazine for just testing, meaning that if you're shooting 6 rolls on a particular setup, that each time you change a roll, you should throw this magazine on there, make an exposure of the way you're going to expose that entire roll, and then keep it, save it, mark it on your documentation sheet. Now, sheet film's a totally different story. You keep just 1 magazine set, make, say, test, first exposures drop in, shoot it, okay, then the next 7, 8 magazines, how many ever transparencies you need, are exposed exactly the same. The next morning, you look at your developments. The decision is made, should it be pushed or pulled relative to what that one is, and then the rest are developed out. Now, what that gives you is to have the ability to have every single exposure exactly the same. And that's the most important thing about this thing, is that when the art director likes a look, that he has a choice of all the different expressions, forms, sets, to where every exposure is right on the money. And that's a lot better than underexposing and overexposing on the actual exposure, because it's just a lot less film to deal with. The most important thing in this entire series is the documentation of the shooting. As you can see right here, we exposed 1 test roll for the head and shoulders, underexposed it a 1/3, and then we got that roll back, underexposed it a 1/3, developed it a 1/3 push, got the film back, identified that those exposures look good. So then what we did is we developed out the rest of them at a 1/3 of the balance to state that, and guaranteed that all the diffuse highlights, all the exposures were right on the money, and the art director had the entire decision of what he wanted to choose from the poses.
3 completely different moods have been captured in this high-key portrait series of a mother and her natural child. Effectively lighting a black skin tone and a white skin tone dispels several myths about exposures, especially when the subjects, background, and vignette are all lit with the same single source of illumination.
You may be wondering why I'm sitting here with such unattractive light on my face. We're trying to distinguish the difference between good exposure and good lighting. Good lighting is subjective, meaning the brightness of the specular and the shadow relative to the diffused. Good exposure is just the diffused looking to what it is, meaning the diffused being the true tone of my flesh and the true tone of my flesh coming through. If I had black skin, I'd appear black. If I had white skin, I should appear white. So good exposure means that I have the true tone of my flesh within the highlight area. The shadow and the specular are subjective. If we can understand that, we'll be able to work with a concept called key shifting, meaning that if you wish to raise the tone, in this case the background, to be brighter than it is right now, you can do it with still 1 light. Instead of adding light to the background, you have to realize that the background is dark because I am very bright. If I wish to make the background brighter, I have 2 options. I can add light to the background, and that would take another light. Some of us don't always have 2 lights. Maybe we only have 1, and we wish to get more usage of that. By simply taking and bringing in a scrim between myself and the main light source, it lowers my value. I become darker. The background stays the same. It still has the same amount of light striking it. But now if we key shift, meaning that bringing my true exposure back, opening up the aperture on your camera or increasing the power on the main light to where I am now properly exposed. So I am now again, the tone of my diffuse highlight is at the proper point on the film. What happens is the background becomes brighter. The reason this is called key shifting is that the background really didn't get brighter. I just got darker. But by shifting my tone, my true diffused highlight back to the proper point of the film, what has stayed constant in the background now becomes brighter. This is why we call it key shifting. You're actually shifting a certain area on the piece of film and then bringing it back through your aperture. Now we have lowered specularity because we have a much larger source of illumination. We have brought up the background because you have dropped my value, opened up the aperture to bring my value back up. The last thing to do subjectively is to bring in the shadow density. That can be done by, since the light is going past the front of the panel as it is behind the panel, it is going to go over and strike a reflector, and by bringing a white reflector panel in, you can now kick light into the shadow area subjectively. If you want the shadow to be darker, you can then back the reflector further away to have more contrast. That is an opinion. That is up to you. So, we have now evenly illuminated the subject, controlled the shadow density, controlled the specular density, and then subjectively controlled the background relative to my value. The last thing we might want to do in this photograph is to tape a piece of acetate onto the front of our lens, a thing called a vignette. Now, this piece of acetate does stop light from going through it. It is somewhat dense itself, but by simply taking it on the lens and then adding a little bit of light onto it, still from the main light source, you're going to suddenly have this vignette that no longer is a contrast to the background. It's part of the background, you might say. It's all one comfortable key. So now we've been able to control the specular, control the shadow, bring up the background to the brightness that we want, and create a vignette quality all with one light.
Collins begins by setting up a single Lightform P22 panel with 2 layers of white reflective fabric. The roll of white seamless background paper will act as the background for this portrait series.
Yeah, come in and get some close-up type ones on that. So you're not going to be using this.
Lightform support legs are connected to the frame of the diffusion panel to enable the panel to stand on its own. Collins then places the panel in the appropriate area for the shoot and moves on to set up the reflector panel. A second P22 panel is used for the frame of the reflector. An EC1 clamp is connected to the light stand and then snapped onto the panel, giving it stability and also making it easily adjustable. A single white reflective fabric is added to complete the reflector. Dean then adds black fabric to the lower half of the diffusion panel, securing it with 2 double clips. This will prevent light from bouncing off the floor and creating a low directional light source. A bronze-color strobe head is placed on a light stand, and the parabolic reflector is removed to create 180 degrees of directional light. Power cables are then connected to a Pulso 4 power pack, and Collins sets the strobe at half power. With his basic lighting complete, Collins assembles a Hasselblad 500 ELX on the Phobos stand. A 250mm f5.6 lens and a Pro lens shade are added, along with a 20-foot remote cable release to complete the setup. For the purpose of illustrating the evolution of this session, the lighting setup has been removed as Collins brings Debon and her mother Denise onto the set. It's important to note the brightly lit studio and Dean's relaxed mood at this time, which sets the attitude of the shoot and helps to remove any fears the child might have in this new and very different environment.
Okay, I'll just stay right there. What you got all over you?
Collins brings in the bare bulb strobe and takes an incident reading with the dome of the meter facing the light source. This reading will establish an 18% value in the subject's area. Dean talks about using one light to do the job.
To get an efficiency out of one light, in this case to make a background go pure white, one single light source high key, we have to realize that a reflective meter is a very important component here. By taking a reflective reading off of any tone, whether it be a black wall or a white wall, we get a reading that will tell us what to set our camera at to make it 18%. That's all those reflective meters know. Now, if we take that reading, let's say in this case the reflective reading off of a white piece of paper was F16. If we shoot at F16, the background's 18%. Great, that's what the photograph would look like. But by taking our aperture and open it up 3 stops, or make the aperture 8 times bigger than f16, which is open it up to f5.6, that background becomes white without detail. It was called an 8-to-1, 8 times brighter than 18%. Now, we know then that if we are going to make a piece of white paper pure white, that with one light strike in it, if the reflective reading read f16, we wish to open our aperture up to f5.6. What opens our aperture up to f5.6? The exposure of the subject area. So to make the background go pure white, we get a reflective reading of f16, walk up, get an incident reading of the subject area. We want that area to read f5.6 so we can set our camera to f5.6. We do that by dropping a scrim in between the strobe and the subject, which lowers the subject value to f5.6. Now, if it doesn't lower to f5.6, if it lowers it to f8, we wish to put more and more layers of diffusion material on that scrim. In this case, it would be nothing more than ND material at this point. It's not diffusing it anymore. It's just darkening and darkening. Then, as it finally gets down to f5.6, we can expose it to f5.6. We have a proper exposure of the subject area, and the background, reading a reflective f16, goes white without detail, or in this case, it's called 8-to-1.
With the light of the bare strobe striking both the subjects and the background, Collins poses the mother and the daughter and takes his first test shot.
Can you hear that? Yeah.
Our first check print, although properly exposed, reveals high specularity on both subjects with a hard shadow edge transfer caused by the bare bulb light source. Note the dull gray background. To soften the light qualities on the subjects, Collins brings in the diffusion panel, placing it to ensure complete coverage on Denise and Devin. Dean also makes sure that plenty of light spills past the back of the panel onto the background.
Just like that. Okay.
A second incident reading is taken to measure the intensity of the diffused light to again establish an 18% value in the subject's area. The 2 layers of reflective fabric have considerably lowered the value of the subject's area, but the value of light striking the background has remained constant. Our camera point of view reveals the subjects as the aperture is opened up to f5.6 for the proper subject value, with the background brightness increasing at the same rate. Collins then takes a reflective reading with the Minolta 4 meter and a 5-degree spot attachment to check for light fall off across the background. The varied readings tell Collins that he must readjust the white seamless to ensure even illumination throughout his background.
Working with one light on that background, trying to light the subject and the background, sometimes you'll see fall off on the background. Viewing through the lens, if you had a, say not a 250, more like a 150 millimeter lens, you're going to pick up an entire wide spread of the background. You'll see a fall off because that light source, that strobe, is closer to one side of that paper than it is the other. So the light falls off for the square of the distance, the inverse law. So it's important to pick up a proper angle of that reflective paper, to pick up one side and move it around to where the piece of paper behind the subject is even relative to the light source, to where the strobe evenly illuminates the entire area. Now your camera's never going to pick that up because your camera's taking a 2-dimensional photograph. I mean, so you're not going to pick up that 3-dimensionally, and it's going to evenly illuminate it. And you can check that by taking a reflectometer and taking readings all the way across the background that your camera is viewing, and seeing if it is all within the same proper exposure. Real good. Okay. Listen, I'll tell you what.
Ready for his second test shot, Collins works with Denise and Devin to find an effective pose and makes the exposure. In comparison to our first test shot, the use of the diffusion panel in our second shot has softened the edge transfer between the diffused highlight and the shadow, while also lowering the brightness of the specular highlights on both subjects. Also note that the change in aperture has now created a background of white without detail. Collins brings in a P22 panel with a single layer of white reflective fabric to act as a reflective fill. Raw light spilling past the front of the main diffusion panel strikes the white reflector to produce a non-directional, low specular fill in the shadow areas. Contrast of the diffused highlight to the shadow can be judged by eye. Collins then proceeds to capture the mood of the sitting and create our next test shot. With the addition of the reflector fill in check print number 3, we can see that the intensity of the shadow areas has been raised from the soft, non-directional light of the reflector fill. Remember, only one light source is being used to control our main light reflector fill, and the background.
Using a white reflector to fill in the shadow in this case was important because not only did the raw light go past the panel onto the background, but it also went past the front of the panel and hit the reflector. If we would have had a silver reflector, which has always been thought of as the reflector you use to fill in the shadow, a silver mylar, that's a very small source when it's raw hitting that. If it is a mylar, it'd be very, very directional light, very hard casting shadows going across the face, almost canceling out the quality of the soft light from the large scrim, and a lot of specularity. So since we did have this powerful amount of light going past hitting, this white reflectors kicking in, we could get away with a white material. And when that small source struck this white material, it diffused it out, gave a very soft quality, and then we had the control to actually keep current or keep constant with the quality of light we were working for in this particular theme.
A reflective reading through an acetate vignette must be 8 times or 3 f-stops brighter than the subject area to ensure an 8:1 ratio or a pure white vignette. Scotch tape secures the vignette to the lens shade.
Great. Yeah. Oh.
With the raw light of the strobe now striking the background, the reflector fill, and the vignette, Collins shoots his final images on Ektachrome EPN 100.
Okay.
The high-key portraits have a soft, pure white base with the vignette made from Roscoe Lux Tough Frost.
Can you sit up real tall there? Just sit up real tall almost, yeah. There you go. All right. When using one light to try to do a high key, lens selection is very, very important. Working with, let's say, a normal lens, to do a 3/4 photograph, you'd have a very large view of that background. The longer your millimeters is, the more you're going to back up to keep a 3/4 length photograph. If you put a 250 millimeter lens up on your camera, you're going to back way up. Now that's going to narrow your view area. You can work with a very small, narrow background behind the subject with a long lens and still be able to do a 3/4 photograph. Now, the efficiency of this is that your fall off in the background is not going to be anywhere, if it is a great deal, you're never going to notice it because you're only viewing a very small area of the background, and if there is a slight fall off, you won't pick it up. If you're viewing a 9-foot background completely, there's probably going to be a good half-stop fall off from one side to the other, and you're going to pick up that gradation in that photograph. So longer lenses are going to help you an awful lot of getting a very even illuminated background.
The ability to control the key of your photograph with your aperture is a concept that can open many avenues in portraiture. With the confidence of properly exposing your subjects, you will gain the freedom to be creative and concentrate on capturing the true emotions of a portrayal.
What you saw today was possibly a little different than what normally happened in the studio. For educational purposes, you might say, we let the cameras come in and film the way we would set up and light a child. A lot of this would be done long before the child would ever enter the room, so it'd be very quick, accurate. The child would sit down and we'd be done with the photograph before they even knew it. But the most important thing to catch out of it is the interaction between the adult and a child. Not to get on their level, but to make sure that they enjoy it, that you're part of them, that you're your friend. A lot of the stuff is very almost doctorish. It's like what happens when you go into a doctor's office, all these lights aimed at you and this steel and this chrome, and it can be very scary because a lot of children don't have a lot of good experience going into doctors and being poked with needles. So when they first walk in here, it can be very, very scary. It's important that you realize that. You realize how nervous they can be and to stay with them, to keep with them. And the moment they walk in here, not to have it very, very dark and a very bright area in one spot. Make sure the whole place is well lit up to where they feel very comfortable, and don't even let them know what's going on. Sit them down and play with them, and then if it is going to be a series of interactions between the mother and child, or very serious or very happy, work it out as well as you can and realize probably the least expensive thing you have right now is the film. I mean, and you burn a few images here and there and make sure, pick out what you want, and that magic shot's going to come up if everything's on film properly and you let it happen on its own. Big smooches, oh, big smooches. Big smoochies. Oh my goodness, all these loves. Don't pick your nose. No. Well, you pick your nose, I won't take a picture of it.